Okay, welcome to section 7 of the notes here. We are going to talk about the Marshall Court. Before we start, I want to do a little quick review of the War of 1812. When we look at what began the war, what caused the war, it really was that disrespect of the British towards the United States of our newly found independence. So the British did not recognize us as a separate nation or as a nation that could compete with them. So they were essentially looking at us as if we were still the colonies that they once had control over. The way they showed this was interfering with our shipping. Remember that impressment, the British taking our ships, taking our sailors, forcing them to serve in the British Navy. The British were also interfering with our expansion. Remember, the British are working with the Native Americans by giving them weapons in order to prevent us from moving into the territory that we acquired under Jefferson, that big Louisiana territory. Also, pushing us towards war, Southerners are going to turn their attention to Florida that had been held by the Spanish, and the idea that we should have Florida. And Spain was an ally of the British, so we're already mad at the British. We might as well go after their allies, the Spanish, as well. The War Hawks, which were the group of politicians in Congress that supported the war, are going to want to get rid of or expel the British completely from North America. We don't want them around us at all. What we see after the War of 1812, though, is that while we didn't win the war, we also didn't lose the war, but it reveals to us that we need a stronger army. We can't get into another conflict that we could possibly lose. What we are also going to see after the war is this feeling of nationalism. Because we could hang on to our independence and we don't lose it when we face off against the British again, people are going to want to support this country, push forward. At the end of the War of 1812, there is no longer going to be a Federalist Party. Remember, we talked yesterday about the era of good feelings. It's called that because we only have one political party, and that's because the Federalist Party is gone. Also, throughout the War of 1812, because the Native Americans were aligned with the British, we were also fighting the Native Americans. In this fight, we kind of disband that idea that the Native American tribes could all unite into this one huge powerhouse through the fighting that we see. So we take down the strength of the Native American resistance or fight against Americans moving into our settlements. The War of 1812 also opens a pathway for the United States to acquire or get the state of Florida. So we do have some positive effects from the War of 1812. We do learn lessons from the War of 1812. It is important for us to recognize that even though we didn't lose this war, we didn't win this war, it is the second American Revolution, and that we prove that we can keep hold of our independence. The Marshall Court is going to be called that because of Chief Justice John Marshall. Chief Justice John Marshall is going to be put into the position nominated by John Adams, our second president. He is going to serve as Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835, and he is going to be what we call a Federalist. Adams was a Federalist, so he nominated a Federalist into the Supreme Court. What that means is Marshall supports a strong federal government, and along with that comes a strong federal or national economy. So the decisions that Marshall makes during his time as Chief Justice are going to reflect that. Now, there's a 4-part legacy that Marshall leaves behind. The first part is that the Supreme Court is going to obtain the power of judicial review during Marshall's time as Chief Justice. And we'll see where that comes from in just a second. During Marshall's time as Chief Justice, we also see that the Supremacy Clause is strengthened, this idea that federal laws are superior or above state laws. During his time as Chief Justice, Marshall is going to broadly interpret the Constitution to find implied powers. Because of this, we call him a loose interpreter of the Constitution, using the elastic clause, reading between the lines to find more powers for the federal government. Also, during Marshall's time as Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice, we are going to see a definition for what's called the sanctity of contracts. This idea of the sanctity of contracts is going to limit the state government's power to interfere with business. Under the Articles, the states had that power. They were allowed to control business, to conduct business, to kind of set their own limitations and rules, structure. But under Marshall, he's going to say that's not a state power. We have a new constitution that belongs to the federal government. All of these parts to his legacy fall in line with the fact that the federal government is meant to be strong because he is a federalist. The first court case that we need to look at is going to be Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is a case that begins with John Adams. John Adams, remember, second president of the United States, is going to be a Federalist. He is going to lose after his first term to Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. Now, on his way out of the presidency, Adams is going to make what we call now midnight appointments. These midnight appointments are positions that Adams wanted to fill with Federalists, to keep the Federalists still in power, even though we were transitioning to a Democratic Republican presidency. One of those people that he appoints is Marbury. Marbury is going to be put in the position of a justice for D.C. What happens, though, is all these appointments are just written on pieces of paper. These pieces of paper say this person gets this job. Now, those pieces of paper are supposed to be delivered by the Secretary of State. When Jefferson comes into the presidency, he has his own Secretary of State, which is Madison. Madison is a Democratic Republican. When he looks at these appointments, these pieces of paper that are all filled with Federalists that are about to have jobs in the government, he says, you know what? I don't think I'm going to deliver them. So Madison refuses to deliver the papers. When he refuses to deliver the papers, that means that Marbury doesn't get his job. Marbury gets very upset by this and says, that's my job. I should be allowed to have that job. He has to give me the papers. And this case makes its way in front of Chief Justice John Marshall. Now remember, we said Marshall was a Federalist. The Federalist Party is going to think that Marshall will side with Marbury and just give him the job so that the Federalists could have these positions. Instead, Marshall says, nope, I am denying this appointment, which kind of makes him look like he's supporting the Democratic Republicans. But Marshall is thinking of the bigger picture here. And what he's actually doing is declaring an act that had been put into place called the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. This Judiciary Act had said that Adams was allowed to make these appointments for justices all over the country. But what Marshall does is when he reads this, he says that's not really the president's job. The Constitution says that that's actually Congress's job. So the Judiciary Act that gave Adams those powers is unconstitutional, which means Marbury really doesn't get to have that position because Adams didn't have the right to give it to him. By doing this, declaring the Judiciary Act unconstitutional, Marshall claims a huge power for the Supreme Court, and that's the power that we've come to be known as judicial review. The idea that the Supreme Court can declare an act or a law unconstitutional. The Constitution doesn't actually say that anybody has this power. We've seen this power be used by the states before in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that claimed the states had the power to declare acts of the federal government unconstitutional when they said that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. But here, the Supreme Court is taking on that power. And Marshall kind of solidifies the place of the Supreme Court in the federal government by taking on this power. This is the only time in Marshall's time as Chief Justice that he goes against the federal government. Never again in the 34 years that he's Chief Justice does he declare another federal law unconstitutional. Instead, he's going to find ways to expand the power of the national federal government by broadly interpreting or loosely reading the Constitution. So judicial review comes from the case Marbury versus Madison. The second case that we need to know about, you only have to know 3 for the Marshall Court. The second one is called McCulloch versus Maryland. This is going to happen in 1819. The idea behind this case is the question of the National Bank. Now, we know the National Bank came from Alexander Hamilton, and when the National Bank was put into place, there was an argument between the Federalists that said we should have the power to have this national bank, and those that said it doesn't say in the Constitution that the government has the power to create this bank, therefore they shouldn't be allowed to. Remember, Hamilton believed we should have the national bank. Jefferson believed we should not. In this case, we are going to see that the national bank is coming into question again. The national bank had been established throughout the country. There were many national banks throughout the states. What was happening is the national bank was being threatened by local and state banks that were already established because they're competing, right? They're all kind of doing the same thing, different levels, but they're banks. In Maryland, in order to protect the banks that already existed in Maryland, the state of Maryland is going to levy or put in place taxes on the operation of the banks. They hoped in Maryland that by putting these taxes on transactions that the bank had to conduct, that eventually the national bank would cease to exist. Along comes James W. McCulloch, who was a cashier at the Baltimore branch of the National Bank. In his job, he was supposed to collect the tax that was to be paid to the state of Maryland when he did transactions. McCulloch is going to say, I will not collect this tax. It's not right that Maryland is collecting it, therefore I will not do it to jeopardize this bank. Well, that puts McCulloch at odds with the state of Maryland, which is a case that can end up in front of the Supreme Court. When this case comes before the Supreme Court, the Marshall Court, as a Federalist court trying to expand the powers of the federal government, is going to say that Maryland cannot tax the national bank. So it strikes down the Maryland law that put in the taxes on the national bank. The court was unanimous altogether in their decision that the national government has these powers that are not outlined in the Constitution, which include the national bank. This case insisted that Congress had the power to charter or put in place the national bank, and no state could compete or destroy the bank with any taxes. So again, what we see through Marshall's decision with the Supreme Court in supporting this national bank, that we again give the federal government more powers. We're proving again that we are a Federalist, siding with the federal government. McCulloch versus Maryland, all about the national bank. We have one final case to go over here, and it is Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons versus Ogden is all about steamboats and commerce, which is trade, business. Now, in New York State, there had been a law that was passed that gave certain operators the power to operate steamboats in the waters within that state. So essentially, New York State picked out certain people and said, you get to navigate these waters and you're in charge. You get to say what goes on these waters. You get that job. Now, the states would carry this law on to set laws that required out-of-state boats to pay larger fees to gain privileges on their waters. So essentially, in New York State, if you were coming from New Jersey to trade in New York, you would have to pay a fee to just be allowed to come and do your business on the waters in New York. What this ended up doing is giving a certain person called Aaron Ogden a monopoly or complete control on the operation of the waters in New York. Now, Thomas Gibbons, who was a steamboat operator who did business going from New Jersey and New York, is going to say, this isn't fair. Aaron Ogden gets complete control and gets to charge me a higher price, which prevents me from doing business here. Marshall is going to look at this case and say, I agree with Thomas Gibbons. It is not fair that a steamboat monopoly was granted in the state of New York. When Marshall looks at this case, he is going to say that that monopoly that was given to Aaron Ogden to control the business of steamboats in New York is unfair because that operator that ran his business between the state of New Jersey and New York couldn't openly do so. Furthering that position, Marshall is going to say that business crossing state lines, that commerce, that interstate commerce, is really supposed to be dictated or outlined by the federal government, not the states. So again, in this case, Gibbons versus Ogden, we see Marshall extending the powers of the federal government, really just clarifying what's in the Constitution by broadly defining the terms of commerce and saying that federal law is above state law. This is the Supremacy Clause. Going back to that four-part legacy of the Marshall Court, the Supremacy Clause clarifying it and furthering it for the federal government is a part of that legacy. Tomorrow we are going to cover part 1 of the Jacksonian era, and then we will follow it up with part 2. Don't forget to do your reading on Marbury versus Madison for this section, and if you have any questions on the content, let me know.